What does the Bible say about women speaking in church?
That they're to be absolutely silent and never speak.
That's a verse that they're trying to
Yes, there's
go to
a there's
for
a
sure.
passage that you're probably referring to in 1 Corinthians 14, and this is one where guys take off, and I was being facetious, but where guys take off and they say things like that. And it's in 1 Corinthians 14:34. It says, "Let your women keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but they are to be submissive, as the law also says. And if they want to learn something, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it's shameful for women to speak in church." And so people will go, if a woman speaks in church, it's sin, and it needs to stop. The problem with that interpretation of the passage is that you have an earlier passage that talks about women prophesying. And so it says, this is in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, it says, "Every man praying or prophesying having his head covered dishonors his head, but every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, for that's one and the same as if her head were shaved." This is talking about putting on veils in the passage. The point that I'm making here is Paul is talking to the church in Corinth about women prophesying, not just praying, but prophesying. And if you're prophesying, you are speaking things out loud, and you're speaking things out loud to other people in the fellowship. And so Paul is not going to tell them how to prophesy properly in chapter 11, tell women how to prophesy properly in chapter 11, and then in chapter 14 come along and say, by the way, they can't do it at all. That doesn't make any kind of sense. And so context is important when you're looking at these passages. And the context in 1 Corinthians 14 is they have all kinds of things that are going on in their church that are causing just chaos. And it looks like one of them had to do with women asking questions. And that's what's being spoken about here. Earlier on, he's just talked about the proper use of the gift of tongues. That's another whole can of worms. He talks about proper use of prophecy. Let 2 or 3 prophets speak, and let the others judge, in verse 29. If anything is revealed to another who sits by, let the first keep silent. In other words, don't talk over the top of each other. For you can all prophesy one by one, that all may learn and all may be encouraged. He says in verse 32, the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets, for God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints. And so there he's telling you that if you're going to prophesy, the Spirit of God is not taking you over and making you do it in such a way that you can't take turns. Spirit of the prophets is subject to the prophets. You can decide when you're going to speak. And then he makes the point that God's not the author of confusion. Then he brings up another issue of confusion, which apparently had to do with women asking about what was going on in a service. And so very early on, in the synagogues at the time of the New Testament, men and women were separated. So the men were down in the main floor of the synagogue, and there was usually a balcony, or there was an area in the back where the women and the children would be, and children that were younger than 13, and girls. And so the men and the women were separated, and the only ones who were actually involved in the service were the men and the young men, 13 years old and older. Well, when Christianity comes along, there's no difference between male and female, Jew or Greek, and bond or free, and so on. And so women were now allowed into the service. And so there's a question as to whether or not this was causing some problems because of basically ladies not being sensitive to what was going on in the service. And actually in a lot of early churches, and this is a tradition that went on, continued on in some of the Greek Orthodox churches, they would separate the men and the women in the service. And so they'd have the men sit on one side of an aisle and the women sit on another side of the aisle. And so famously, commentators have said they think that what was happening was the women were calling across the aisle to their husband when the pastor would make a point and they didn't understand it. What's he talking about, honey? And my wife, I taught that one time, and she said, that is just nonsense. That's not what ladies do. They weren't doing that. They were doing what they do in the mother's room. And so she's been in mother's rooms before. And when the pastor would make a comment or tell a really great joke, that's what usually happening at my church.
No doubt.
Yeah. Everybody in the mother's room would start talking about the comment, and the people who were trying to listen couldn't hear the next points that I was making. And she said, that's what's happening. It's not the women are calling across the aisle. That would be dumb. It's the women are talking amongst themselves and disrupting the service. And so what Paul's doing there is talking about disruptions in the service. He's not saying that women can not speak absolutely in a church service. The Bible, again, clearly teaches that women are to pray and prophesy in church. So
The people try to make this a sexist issue or male chauvinist issue or Christianity bashes women. Obviously, you went through all the culture and everything. You're not even close. But it's like if you've ever been married, you know that there's no way this verse works in that way and still have a functioning church
Right, yeah.
to be able to do that. It's like, come on, guys. Clearly, there's more going on.
Even as you're going through the book of Acts, Lydia was a seller of purple, and she's the one who had Paul come in and begin the church in her town.
Right.
And so you have there's ladies that are mentioned as deaconesses in the book of Romans, and so you have ladies involved in all areas of church in the first century, as just like they are now. Mm-hmm. And so you have to put these in their context. When people are trying to make this a chauvinist passage, they're forgetting that I quoted from the passage that says that there's neither male nor female, bond nor free, Jew nor Greek. That's from Paul the Apostle. Mm-hmm. He's the guy who said these things. And so again, that's just nonsense. When you go through and look at Paul's letters, he's constantly commending ladies that are serving in the churches and serving in areas of ministry in the churches. So,
which is totally against the culture at that time.
Totally.
So they are reversing the male chauvinism, not adding to it.
Yeah, they're reversing the situation that you have in the synagogues.
Yeah.
Specifically, ladies are allowed in the service. So.
Not to beat a dead horse, but Jesus did the same thing. When he's talking to women, and they're like, "Why are you talking to that Gentile woman?" And so.
The women were the first at the tomb. The women were there at the first meeting of the apostles, the 120. When they met together, the women were there in Acts chapter 2 when the Holy Spirit was given. It's like there's no distinction
for sure.
As far as their involvement nowadays versus first century. So it's always been like that.
Okay.